Okay, Year 11, this revision video is about the transition of Scrooge. The first two quotations I wanted to go through today are from stage 1, okay, and it's important to remember this. We're looking at the initial stages of the text here, where Scrooge is characterised as quite a villainous character, or an overtly villainous character, but there's something quite funny about his portrayal. You know, it's just a bit too over the top, really. It's more like a parody rather than something that's explicitly terrifying, and perhaps Dickens is kind of saying here, well, the selfish behaviour of some of the middle class is so ridiculous, so over the top, that it's quite funny, somewhat humorous. He's mocking them essentially with this characterisation of Scrooge. Also important to remember that he is a representative of Thomas Malthus. He's a Malthusian representative, and Thomas Malthus was a Victorian economist who theorised that Britain was becoming overpopulated, okay, and that inevitably our demand for food will outstrip our ability to supply it. In other words, if we continue increasing our population, then we will plunge the country into kind of famine. And he believed that war, poverty and disease aren't actually necessary to regulate the population, which may sound perhaps logical, if somewhat simplistic, but essentially what he's saying is that we need to sacrifice the few in order to save the many, which inevitably in this circumstance would mean sacrifice the most unfortunate, okay, the most vulnerable citizens in society. Obviously a highly unethical point of view there, okay. So the first quotation is this one: a squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner, hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel had ever struck out a generous fire. And like I say, you know, this is a very over the top, hyperbolic, cumulative list of forceful verbs, okay, making Scrooge seem, you know, again, not necessarily terrifying, almost kind of ridiculous in many ways. So these forceful verbs altogether kind of characterise him as incredibly aggressive, almost kind of tangibly violent, and highlights those kind of very forceful efforts to squeeze profits from everyone that he encounters. Remember the couple from stage 4, the shadow that he cast over them, because they were indebted to him. You get the impression that he takes advantage as a moneylender of the most vulnerable in society, increases his the interest that they owe him, forgot that word, and then therefore, you know, he is kind of putting them, deepening their kind of position within the most kind of unfortunate rungs of society, and does that by force. Okay, they have no other choice because they owe him that money. There's also this religious allusion here that I'm sure you haven't missed, okay, and it parallels his kind of avarice, his greed with Christian sin, and indeed greed is one of the cardinal sins, okay. And Dickens is kind of revealing to us that actually greed, the extent of the corruption it can cause in you is spiritual. It's not just a characteristic flaw, it's not just a personality trait. Greed is something that can become kind of embedded into your soul, okay, very hard to extract over time. And both of these, the cumulative list of forceful verbs coupled with the religious allusion here, characterises Scrooge as somewhat kind of barbaric or kind of beastly. Certainly he seems not quite human, okay, and Dickens is representing greed as this kind of contagion, a disease that deforms and strangles all human empathy, okay. And if you think about kind of ignorance and want later on, you know, they are the embodiment of that, of how one social group's greed can kind of deform an entire class, an entire community of people, so that they seem almost not even human anymore. The tactile metaphor here, from which no steel had ever struck out a generous fire, shows Scrooge's potential to give generously in order to improve the lives of others, but obviously he selfishly withholds this in order to hoard his own money and secure his own kind of position. he the use of fire here, is used all the way throughout the text. Okay, it becomes this kind of wider metaphor. Think about the Cratchits. They gather in a circle around the hearth, the fireplace. Fred is always characterized as someone who's warm and glowing. Okay, and fire and warmth becomes a wider metaphor for emotional fulfillment. Dickens's measure of kind of true wealth is emotional fulfillment, not monetary gain, not money. Second quotation from day one: "It is enough for a man to understand his own business and not to interfere with others. Mine occupies me constantly." Scrooge says this in response to the charity workers. Okay, and he's basically saying, look, I just mind my own business. I'm not responsible for anyone else. And this transactional noun business shows the kind of what it means to kind of invest your time and energy into a project, into an endeavour. But for Scrooge, he only invests his time and energy into profit and gain, and only perceives the world through a capitalistic lens. Okay, rather than focusing his time and energy on mankind, as the Christmas present advises him to do later on. When he says here, I'm not going to interfere with others, as in I'm not going to kind of take part in the social circumstances of others, that even the most unfortunate, it's reflective of these kind of individualistic ideals, okay, that characterize Victorian society. And basically, individualism is the ideology that you only have responsibility for yourself. Okay, so responsibility is for oneself and no one else. So you are at liberty to do whatever you want to secure your own happiness, to pursue your own kind of objectives. But unfortunately, when you're so focused, when you're individualistic and you're only focused on yourself, you cannot focus on anyone else, and you reject responsibility for everyone else. And those kind of individualistic attitudes were so common during the Victorian era, and they exacerbated the social divide. Okay, they gave rise, as it says here, to capitalism, which we see in an Inspector Calls. So essentially, A Christmas Carol is kind of like the precursor, like the prequel to Inspector Calls, in the sense that whatever happened in the Victorian era, okay, the post-industrial revolution, the widening class divide, and that kind of increasing popularity of individualistic attitudes, that is what gave rise to the kind of conditions that allowed Mr. Burling to come into power, essentially. Okay, and it's also these kind of attitudes and the attitudes of Thomas Malthus that meant that the Poor Law in 1834 kind of came about. Okay, remember this, the Poor Law in 1834 reduced financial aid to the lower classes, and instead of kind of offering provision, what they did do was the government set up workhouses where the most poor in society, so able-bodied poor, would work there in order to earn a small amount of money, and also to earn somewhere to kind of earn keep and somewhere to live and food. But the conditions were horrifying in order to kind of put them off being unemployed. But essentially, it was like a prison, and really we were punishing the most unfortunate in society for just for the position that more often than not they were born into, rather than kind of be landing themselves there through any responsibility of their own. And then in this quote as well, he says his business occupies him constantly, and yeah, you can see that kind of obsession with money, business, kind of, it seems almost to possess him. Links to that idea of greed being a kind of contagion. It's like he's infected, and he's completely infected soul and body by his own greed. So what happens later? Well, interestingly enough, this quotation, squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching. We see the word clutching again later on, in quite a significant moment where Scrooge is clutching at the spirit's robes in stave, it says 5 there, it means stave 4, okay, out of desperation. He wants to change, and he's asking the Ghost of Christmas Yet to Come, do I have a chance for change here? And we see that his desperation has changed from Stage 1, where it was driven completely by greed and the need for money, okay, in order to kind of secure his position in society. And now in stage 4, it's driven by the need for change, so his transformation, his kind of spiritual and emotional transformation, is near enough complete in stage 4 because his desires and his objectives have changed. So second set of quotations here, okay, are these ones from stage 2. A solitary child neglected by his friends is left there still. And then just following on from that, in stage 2, I should like to have given him something. That's all Scrooge says, referring to the carol singer from stage 1. Now, the solitary child here is Scrooge himself, isn't it? He sees himself as a child in his boarding school. And this is a really commonly analysed quotation, because you've got here the neglected and left, which are very passive verbs, okay? And it shows that he has been abandoned by those that are meant to care for him, that are responsible for his protection. And it shows his lack of agency, okay? Here he is, he's completely powerless. So you can understand why, he might, rather than powerlessly being isolated by others, he might try to turn that around and kind of take ownership of his loneliness by instead rejecting the people around him. It's a method of coping with that powerlessness, isn't it? But actually, neglect is also a form of child abuse. So this is a more pitiful portrayal of Scrooge here, and we feel sympathy for him. He's been conditioned into this loneliness and has gotten so used to it that later on it becomes all he can really do is to isolate himself. He doesn't know how to be around people, and he doesn't know how to care or be compassionate towards others either, seeing as no one was compassionate to him, or very few people were, when he was just a child. Okay, solitary is a really emotive adjective, okay, meaning alone, to exist alone. But also it's a judicial punishment. And what's interesting is that solitary confinement, which is where you isolate prisoners, okay, so they're literally in prison by themselves in one room and unable to interact with anyone else. Solitary confinement was a punishment that was actually kind of made popular in the 1830s in America. And Dickens, being the kind of socially minded individual that he was, actually visited the first prison where solitary confinement was used to see how solitary confinement is used as punishment. And he called it torture that's worse than of the body. So he recognised that there is a certain mental suffering that goes alongside solitary confinement that is so deep-seated and so cruel. And here, I don't believe that this is a coincidence. He uses the same word to describe Scrooge in his early stages of life, as if this child who has already been kind of cruelly punished and incarcerated, and yeah, you can see the idea that this is another social injustice, okay, that children would be treated in this way, and not just the poor, but this middle class child as well, where parents would kind of send them off to these boarding schools in order to focus on making money and securing their own position in the middle class. And actually, that's something quite interesting that I learned in my research of A Christmas Carol, is that Dickens wrote a book called Nicholas Nickleby in his 20s, and the whole book is actually a critique of these Victorian cheap boarding schools, the same kind as what Scrooge went to. So in Scrooge's description, in the description of Scrooge's school, it's decayed and broken. Basically, these were these cheap kind of boarding schools where parents would pay very little to send their child there for a year, and often lower middle class parents sent their children there and abandoned them there to focus on kind of financial gains, okay, and securing and kind of focusing themselves on their businesses or their work, etc. and for Dickens this is a very cruel way to treat young children. So we often think about the children in the text, Tiny Tim, as being reflective of kind of the misery of the poor. Okay, and we often link that to this concept tabula rasa, which was the idea, the theory that the corruption of society is reflected in how miserable children are. So if Tiny Tim is kind of ill, he's crippled, he's not only physically kind of he's kind of physically ill to the point of dying, then that must show that society is incredibly cruel and callous to its poor and its most vulnerable citizen. However, if we link that same concept, so tabula rasa, to Scrooge, well, then this solitary child, this child literally characterized by his own loneliness, surely reflects how the middle class were also kind of guilty of kind of creating miserable children, abandoning them in these cheap boarding schools, rejecting them and rejecting their responsibility for them, in order to kind of focus on profit and to focus on monetary gain. And so therefore, the misery of Scrooge shows the kind of lack of compassion in the middle classes. It reflects that. This quotation here, I should have liked to given him something, that's all. Scrooge says, referring to the carol singer from Save One, once he sees himself as a child, he feels kind of sympathy for that carol singer. And for Scrooge, memory opens up the doors of empathy, which he'd kept closed for so long. Okay, but perhaps here it shows that he hasn't quite learned his lesson, because to give someone something, so this action here, this verb, given him something, he's talking about something kind of material, isn't he? But actually Dickens's message is that generosity doesn't have to be something material. It doesn't have to be money. It can be time, and it can be just your thoughts, your compassion that you're generous with, much like Fred, okay, and how he gives people his time, and that's his act of generosity. So in terms of the placing in the text, well, this obviously happens in stave 2. Stave 2 is very important because it exposes the roots of Scrooge's avaricious behaviour, okay, and also his kind of self-imposed isolation. But it also reminds us that if something has a beginning, then it also has an end. So that's why A Ghost of Christmas Past shows him his past, because the ghost is trying to kind of reveal to him that this is not, your loneliness and your greed is not actually rooted into your character. It's not part of you. It's not something that you can't extract. It's something that has been conditioned by experience and abandonment, and therefore if it's been conditioned into you over time, if it has a beginning, then you can end it as well. You have the power to kind of put an end to this kind of isolating and greedy behaviour. And what happens later? Well, Bell shows us in the same stave how greed has not only kind of victimized those that are more unfortunate than Scrooge, but also kind of severs his most treasured relationships. And like I said before, it shows us that monetary gain, financial gain, does not equate to true wealth. Rather, emotional fulfillment does. Okay. So next lot of quotations. Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by spirit and was overcome with penitence and grief. Are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only? Okay, so this one here is from stave 3. Okay, and it is when Scrooge's response to hearing his own kind of Malthusian rhetoric. Are there no workhouses? Are there no prisons? So Ghost of Christmas Present repeats those words back to him. Okay. And it shows now that he's ashamed of his own words, which actually seem alien to him now. He kind of doesn't even recognise his views from before. Okay, this is a really important quotation because you've got here that hung his head. There's the image of execution. Okay, like hanging. It shows the death of kind of Scrooge's former self. And it's reinforced by those guttural sounds, the H's, and the G's there, show that, you know, there's this kind of stopping of your breath when you voice those sounds, when you vocalize those sounds. And again, it's kind of like this is the end now of Scrooge's former self, and perhaps that's reinforced by the word grief. Is he grieving over the man he once was? Okay, so linking that to the loss of himself as he once was. But we've also got here the word penitence, and that's a Christian allusion. Penitence means kind of a deep kind of remorse and guilt. Okay, penitence, the penitential rites is when you say sorry, when you ask for forgiveness. Okay, so this Christian allusion is reflective of, well, first of all, not only the profoundness of Scrooge's guilt. So, or almost as if here, it's almost like he's uttering a prayer when he hangs his head in penitence. He is seeking God's forgiveness, isn't he? But also reflects Dickens's Unitarian views. The Bible, Dickens believes, is not a rigid set of rules, but is actually a series of examples to learn from. Much like how Scrooge learns from the examples that the ghosts show him from the past, present and the future. It's almost like, by mimesis, Scrooge is also learning from these examples as Dickens wants us to learn from the Bible, or Dickens believes we should learn from the Bible. And therefore, Scrooge's change also becomes an example that we then learn from. And so it's almost like A Christmas Carol becomes this kind of like pseudo means like a somewhat, it becomes like a pseudo kind of Christian allegory. Okay, almost acts like an extension of the Bible in itself. Okay, and we learn from that. The word grief, okay, means to mourn the loss of someone or something, or it means a kind of overwhelming sadness. It shows kind of Scrooge's transition and his transformation. He's now able to feel profound emotion rather than just indifference as he does in stage 1. Okay, this quotation here, are these the shadows of things that will be, or are they shadows of things that may be only, is from stage 4. Okay, when he kind of curiously asks, you know, this Ghost of Christmas yet to come, and that interrogative statement, this question, shows that his curiosity is now projected towards seeking change, basically. Okay, he wants to learn, he's asking questions because he's open to that learning process. The word shadows, this image of darkness, shows that Scrooge understands the apparitions, the visions that he sees of the future are just hollow projections that are changeable. Okay, they have no substance to them. He knows that he is in control of his own fate, and then kind of as a result the fate of those around him as well. But the other way of thinking about shadows is that these images, these visions, will haunt Scrooge. Okay, reminding him of why he must live a reformed life. So from here on, he'll still remember the visions that he saw, and they will act as kind of these haunting kind of lessons there. And remember, in the preface, Dickens says that he wishes to kind of haunt the readers' houses with his messages and his ideas. So in a way, Scrooge will be haunted by his visions, and we will be haunted by Dickens's message of kind of social responsibility. There's a transition here of modal verbs from will be to maybe. Okay, modal verbs is the method there. Okay, showing how likely something is, and will be means, you know, something inevitable. Okay, something that's going to happen. But here Scrooge is realizing that actually these visions are not inevitable anymore. Okay, and it's transitioning to maybe. Now may, you know, something that's possible, but may is also something that you permit. Okay, something has to happen for it to be permitted to happen as a result. And so it's kind of like here Scrooge understands these visions of Tiny Tim's death and his own lonely death is only going to happen if he allows it to happen. Okay, if he doesn't change his ways, and if he is kind of lazy in his kind of moral uprightness. So what else happens in this stave? Well, in stave 3, okay, this is just after ignorance and want appear to Scrooge. Okay, these two deformed children, remember, they are the victims of middle class greed. Okay, and actually, by seeing them, Scrooge, that's when Scrooge says, are there no workhouses, are there are there no, sorry, that's not what he says. He says, are there no refuges, is there no refuge, are there no resources? Okay, and actually, by seeing the ignorance and wants, the two children, it initiates his seeking out of solutions. So it shows us, Dickens is telling us, that we need to confront these social problems head on, in order to trigger a solution to these problems. Okay, and what happens later? Well, in stave 5, okay, as opposed to these shadows, images of light now define Scrooge's life. Okay, so he wakes up, he's as light as a feather, he's glowing, the sun's shining, etc., etc. Is a direct contrast to the shadows of things that will be, and it shows kind of the hope and clarity that now characterises Scrooge's life as a result of his lessons learned. And very lastly, so these two quotations, kind of just following on from that, really, from stave 5. Okay, Scrooge was like a baby, so fluttered and so glowing, etc. And then, I will live in the past, the present, and the future. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. So Scrooge was like a baby. The image of the baby here shows his spiritual rebirth. Okay, so demonstrates his spiritual rebirth. It's the dawning of a new life, and a change that, this is a journey for him, isn't it? This is an ongoing pursuit of change. He might get it wrong every now and then, as a baby and as a child does. There may be mistakes made, but he will grow from them and learn from them, rather than being stunted by them as he is from his childhood. The verb fluttered is this active verb that seems kind of reminiscent of a butterfly. Okay, remember that butterflies kind of go through metamorphosis. They go through a change. They go into the caterpillar goes into the cocoon, comes out as something much more beautiful, something magnificent. Another way of reading that butterfly image is that butterflies are also the symbols, are traditional symbols of mimesis, in the sense that they imitate their surroundings, so they camouflage well. They also, so they're meant to, some butterflies, their patterns look like eyes, don't they, in order to kind of ward off predators. So they mimic nature, they mimic other animals and their surroundings. And here, that symbol of mimesis shows that Scrooge is able to kind of mimic the lessons that the ghosts have taught him. He's able to mimic the more generous members of his family, like Fred, and the more loving members of his community, like Bob Cratchit. He's mimicking them. He's adopting their characteristics in his own life now. Fluttered is also quite heavenly because it's quite angelic. Okay, it shows that he's now challenging, like an angel, channeling rather the word of God through his actions. Okay, like an angel. Glowing, like I said earlier, he's no longer characterized by shadows. He's now radiating this light which permeates to those that surround him. Okay, I will live in the past, present, and future. I will not shut out the lessons that they teach. Okay, so important here that he mentions all three temporal planes. It shows that he has learned from all three ghosts. Okay, we've already spoken about the past and how it's important to learn the roots of your behaviour, because what has a beginning also has an end. But here, the present shows him his wider impact on wider society, so the society that surrounds him now. And future shows him, so Greatest Christmas Yet to Come shows him the consequences on himself and others of his actions. And Dickens reminds us that to live a truly enlightened life, we must keep all three in mind. We have to learn from the past, we have to think about our impact on others now, and we have to think about consequence in the future. What we need to learn from the past, as we did in 1815 in the first Poor Law, is that that we are responsible for those that are the most unfortunate in society, and it's up to us to help them, otherwise they cannot help themselves. Okay, there's lots of repetition of the first person pronoun here, showing his responsibility is firmly placed on himself, and that's what Scrooge understands now. And then obviously lastly you've got the semantics of education, the teaching and learning here, lessons that they teach. For you to really learn, okay, so take note, year 11, you have to actively engage with these lessons, don't you? And it takes a certain investment from the person who's being taught, and it shows here that Scrooge is now actively partaking in that, but also that it's a continual journey. Okay, education is a continual journey, and Scrooge has committed himself to that now. So, last couple of points now. The place in the text, obviously, we're looking at the end of the text, and like a biblical psalm or an allegory, okay, a story from the Bible, the message has to be learned, and the change engendered at the end, so that we can learn as well. So the audience can learn, the readers can learn mimetically. So we'll follow what Scrooge does by imitation. That's how the Bible works. We're meant to imitate the actions of those that have become better people, okay, and then in turn we mimetically learn Dickens's message as well. And then what happens after this bit? Well, Scrooge obviously increases Bob's wages, he commits himself to Tiny Tim, okay, and it shows that his learning is now manifest in action. So his change is complete. It's not quite over, but it is complete. But lastly, that the time he gives the family is the most generous gift of all. And that's what Dickens is kind of imploring us to do, is to be generous with our consideration and our time, not necessarily just our money. Okay, thank you, everyone.